functioning. Um, and I also have PTSD, generalized anxiety disorder. I'm a healing epileptic where I just had brain surgery in December. So they removed a certain section of my brain, and it was actually through a 3-step process. That was 2 prior brain surgeries before I could get the actual final brain surgery.
Oh, wow.
And that was number 6 through 9 of different surgeries I've had for my epilepsy. So, I was one of the worst 30 cases in the country of epilepsy in 2020.
My goodness.
So like I have what totals 3 pages long when you list one per line, you know how doctors do, of different disabilities, but yet I love inspiring others to, like myself, instead of being, just labeled disabled, find a talent within your limitations. And I feel
That's so
like you're
true.
helping companies do that.
Thank you. I'm trying. It's not always an easy task, because I think here in the US, I think the thing that tarnishes it, but it is the one thing that also causes attention, are the lawsuits. And more businesses are more afraid of a lawsuit than actively thinking for inclusion.
Right.
Now, I know in the UK and lots of Europe, they don't have the lawsuits, even Canada. But then they're doing it for the right reasons, because they realize there is a community of special needs, and before it's been overlooked, and they want to address the situation for the right humane reasons, not just because it's in their pocket.
And a lot of people until the pandemic believed that people with disabilities were not being discriminated against. I mean, obviously not the ones with the condition themselves, but since the pandemic, we've uncovered a lot of various sorts of discrimination that have been kind of in the dark. There wasn't an awareness of it, other than potentially the victims knowing about it and suspecting it, but not being in uniform to realize that there were other people suspecting and going through it to actually have knowledge as opposed to feeling that it was going on.
Yeah.
And like we're uncovering about so early on we uncovered about the Black Lives Matter related to different cops and other things that were the people we thought we could trust. And then with the Asian Lives Matter and all these others. And then now, did you realize that there's an awareness related to American Disability Act related? That's another pandemic movement we're in, of like this big problem that has arisen, that now it has this big awareness, like the 2 that most people have heard of, that because we see on the news a lot, the different movements related to those eras, those problems. And now we have, a lot of people don't know, is the American with Disabilities discrimination is becoming more aware, or more broadly known, I should say, but more that the problem has always existed, or just now, this late in the lifetime of our country, realizing that it actually is a problem, like to be public awareness.
Yes. And that's where, if you think of the lawsuits, if you hurt people in their pockets and you publish it for whatever reason, bad publicity is publicity. Doesn't matter.
Right.
And if you take the message from that to bring awareness and take it as a positive, then that helps. And that's the only way, when you think the American Disabilities Act is 31 years old. And it's come a fair way, but I'm sure when they sat back in 1991 and started drafting up the awareness, I expect they would have expected us to be a lot further along than we are now.
Yes, definitely we're behind from where we were intended to be based on how many decades it's been since that law was passed.
Yeah.
Like I remember even when in the 90s, when I was looking for my first job, or even in the early 2000s, when I first entered my profession as a tutorer, I was, of course, at that time just an independent person and not a company. But I remember people saying, don't, if they ask if you have a disability, put no, because if you put yes, they will immediately disqualify you. And I remember hating the fact that I had to then put my signature saying that I had been honest with all of the information I provided. While at that same time, in order to say have equal opportunity, I had to lie on that one part at least.
And an equal opportunity, in one sense, was also much the same thing. It was a token gesture to say that we've got a percentage of people with a disability working for our company. It wasn't because it's like, oh, yeah, and which disabilities can we get? And they would pick the disabilities that the people were near to normal, so they integrated better into the already existing environment they had, as opposed to changing that environment or business culture. Yeah, they wasn't going to change the culture. That you were still accepted to go in and change and adapt to what already existed.
Which means technically, looking at what you're saying and what we're talking about, they were not accommodating to people that had more highly limiting disabilities. They would take the ones that didn't have that much abnormality instead of taking those that maybe could do the job better because of, like, for example, it was on 60 Minutes somewhere in the last month or two. I don't know if it was August or September, but there was one of the 60 Minutes that was about how certain companies are specifically hiring people with autism because they found people with autism have a very key sense to detail and can do anything from accounting, where you're looking for where it's even one penny off and find it, to things like with coding of different web applications or mobile apps and so forth, and find those small little details that are the tiny piece that's why the whole thing is falling apart. And so they actually found a talent within that limitation. That so that's good news for those with autism. But at the same time, the reality is, outside of these certain companies that are finding this, and maybe some that have changed because of that being on 60 Minutes, that otherwise they're what you're talking about, where it's, oh, well, they can't handle the noise, they can't handle the bright lights, they can't handle all these other things, so they require a lot more accommodations. I'm just going to write them off.
Yeah, and and I think that's been common practice for most businesses for a long period of time. It's only today, I think, that we're finding that because there are, let's say, a diversity of different disabilities, and now that we're coming together as a huge group, now it is a force to stand by and think, oh, hang on a minute, you can't, and now we can use the word, you can't prejudice me just for that one thing, because there's a whole group of us.
And kind of like how you said about we're now uncovering a lot of other disabilities, is that something I was talking to somebody earlier today, and when I was working with somebody else, we were talking about research and medical findings of different health conditions. And she made a point, and this lady I was talking to said, I wonder how it is that in this decade, there are this many more people with condition A. And I said, well, do you think it's really that there are that many more people with condition A? I said, or do you think that it's existed for the hundreds of years of our country's lifetime, but because we didn't know such a condition existed, the people were not labeled. So they had it, but it was not known, as opposed to that the condition actually newly developed. It was already here. It's not that it's newly here, it's that we finally realized what it is, and depending upon which condition, potentially now have treatments for it for the person to be able to function better within society, such as, their mood being stabilized so they can work a job, as long as maybe they get these certain accommodations of restricted noise or whatever, right? But they're employable once they're on medication. But if it wasn't for these researches finding about problem A and then later problem B, and then from the researchers from there going into what's treatments for problem A and problem B, that eventually these people, the condition already existed, but these people can now function in society that they couldn't 100 years ago.
Yeah, it's very similar to a conversation I had recently, based on the same thing. How many people in their 50s and 60s are on the edge of the spectrum of some kind of autism type? Because when I went to school, now someone said this to me and said, were you ever tested or diagnosed? I went, no, why? He says, well, when you listen to the story that when you was at school, lack of attention, reading was a challenge for me. And the main
Yes.
reason that I just could not remain focused long enough. So the teacher took me out the classroom one day and said, look, you've got to read this page at least. So I now have to evaluate your reading skills. So we go out and it's a nice summer's day in summer. So it has to be a rare day for that to happen. We sit out and literally I was worse outside than I was in the class. Why was that? Well, it's a new environment. The new environment had different things moving, like a little breeze. So therefore there'd be a leaf or maybe a sweet wrapper blowing across the playground in the
Yeah, or like
schoolyard.
bugs or anything, really.
Well, yeah, the cloud suddenly moved or the sun went in,
Right.
you
There's a
know,
lot of movement disruption.
a lot of disruption. And she went, oh, you're worse out here than you're in the classroom. Do you want to go back in the classroom? I went, oh, okay, yeah. And even though the classroom was more disruptive, I could focus better because I knew my surroundings, I knew my environment, and therefore I could actually focus on the page in question. Outside, no, because again, you take people out of their comfort zone, what are you doing? All the other elements that are around you now heighten themselves, and now you're fully aware. You're uncharged.
Right. So I have a question. Are you saying that you're on the spectrum, or was that an example?
That was an example. I wouldn't say I am. I've never been tested. If I am, I don't know about it. I've never decided to pursue it. But it was just that somebody who is on the spectrum actually looked up and said, you might be borderline.
Well, what I found interesting, which is why I was wondering if you really were, me using as an example versus it being truth about your own health, it's because I mentioned this in another podcast before, but I made it all the way through my K to 12, graduating, going to college, getting my bachelor's degree, then graduating with my master's degree before they actually found out I was autistic. Because in the times of my youth growing up, it was understood that if you were intelligent, you couldn't be autistic because low function with mental challenges or intellectual challenges, we now call it, was the only way that you could actually be autistic. Because there's no such thing in my youth as being both intelligent and autistic. So all those years, they didn't know how to accommodate. I mean, they provided various, things like a room for me to go talk to the teacher that was kind of like therapeutic because of my emotional instability that came with my autism. And later on to find out that I developed PTSD when my parents divorced and I felt the loss of, my dad and other things like that. But they were not able to appropriately accommodate, like lowering these really bright lights or quieting the really loud place or all these others like you're talking about, sticking within familiar grounds, but where you can focus without the noise and whatnot around. They weren't able to do that because they didn't even know I was autistic, and they didn't know I was because it was the research hadn't even found such a thing as high function. So they just wrote me off as other health impaired. They're like, something's wrong with her, but we have no clue what.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Are they highly strung if you had too much candy for the day? It was just down to parents and adults' perception of why the children were acting out or acting out of sync from everybody else.
Right. Yeah, and even
And that's
autism was
difficult.
at one point, like you're saying, acting out. At one point, autism was considered a label and an excuse for kids to act out.
Yes.
Because at one point, the research was not deep enough or possibly even over a long enough period to realize that there's actually an abnormality in the way their brain functions, as opposed to them being just, so to say, spoiled, undisciplined children.
Mhm. Yeah. It's amazing to think how the research has gone, which it hasn't increased the amount of people with, it's just managed to highlight the areas where we can all feel that, oh, now I understand why that happens.
Right.
And, when you say, are you on the spectrum? How many people are borderline, never been tested because they have never looked for the signs and have attributed their life and adapted to work in, let's call it, the normal society that everybody knew?
Well, I think your point about they never looked at the symptoms or signs is kind of a mix of both that and them not being aware of the signs to know to look for them.
Valid
Because
point.
how many people, especially before the internet, where we can now look up, what are causes of, and then whatever we're dealing with, right? to get some kind of idea, even if it's a list of 15 things and we know we need to talk to a doctor to see which one, right?
Mhm.
But go back before 2000 and the dot-com boom, we didn't have that. So if you didn't know how to do research, remember how we used to have to go through those files to look up something by a book by its subject or by the author, and all
Yes.
of a sudden it's like, well, what if I don't know what it's called? How am I
Mhm.
supposed to find it? And now Google does all that for us, or maybe even another browser. I mean,
Mhm.
search engine. But I mean, so we may have had some information, but a lot of us who weren't trained on that old school flipping through those files to find where's the book we want, or if it even exists, then those limitations, like I remember that was hard for me with my autism. And I was like you, not very good at comprehension. And they found that had to do with the certain part of my brain that does the comprehension was a part that was abnormal because of the understanding later on in life that autism is actually a neurological physical malfunction within the brain. And they
Yeah.
found out what part in my brain specifically. But we had those limitations. And if we couldn't even understand how to use that, we couldn't go read books and do research and figure out, well, what are these possibilities of what I may have? And that, okay, now I know there's a risk of these. Let's go talk to a provider.
Yeah.
So we wouldn't even know that we had potential of something. So we wouldn't even know how to know that. And neither would we know to go see a whatever kind of doctor to try to figure out.
Yeah, and of course, thankfully, doctors have managed to, even scientists, classify and categorize. So now people become more expert in that to realize and now to help, because it's fine recognizing the disease as such or the ailment, but what you need is how to integrate and have a support system around you so that integration becomes natural for the patient.
Right.
And I
Yeah.
do it that way round because everybody else is considered they live in a life of normality in a perfect world, in a perfect bubble. Now,
As false as that is, that's so, I mean, that's sad.
yeah, but
But what's sad
until we
is that
pollute that bubble with
we do.
differences, yeah,
And you know what's sad about that? Like, so with my PTSD and everything, I see a therapist regularly. And like one thing she's pointed out to me before, I never would have thought, but I later after she said it, I was like, that really is true. Is that so many of us with some kind of special needs, and this is kind of going with what you're saying. We even more so need a support system, family, friends, co-workers, like various people to support us in the emotional, mental health or other forms of ways so we can function. Because there's so many ways with our special needs, we can't do these certain things, so we need somebody to help out while we can do this other thing. And yeah, she said the biggest problem is that with the exception of me, none of her patients she's had in her career, and she's been in this field for some 30 something years, my therapist, have had even near the size of a support system I do. She said her other patients may have one or two family members that understand and try to help them, but no friends. Or they might have one or two friends, but no family members that help them. Versus on the other end, I've got a lot of friends and a big family that are all understanding to a point that I think they know my condition better than I do because of my autism. I may not be totally aware of the reality of the world,
mhm.
but they are to even the point that they can tell me, okay, Jen, I understand you don't understand this certain thing, but this is the reality, so let me handle it.
Yes,
So that's what we need. But
mhm.
based on what my therapist is saying over the last 30 something years of her career and how many hundreds of clients she's had, maybe 1,000, that is also very scarce for those who need it the most.
Yeah. And thankfully, because if you've got a support system, no matter who it is, they see the irregularities for us, which would be normality. And it's quite often somebody looks up to a person, and even if they don't have an ailment of some kind, say, "Are you feeling okay today? You look a little bit off color. Your temper is a little bit odd.
Yeah.
And whether you have a disability or not, other people see people with ailments before maybe you actually do. Think, well, actually, yeah, I do have a bit of a temperature, or I've got a bit of an ache here, or for some reason I don't feel as chirpy as before. And then you start looking within yourself for the solution and an answer. But other people
Right. You
normally,
speculate within yourself because of what these other people say that they find are so odd about you.
yes,
Like you being a general you. Yeah.
Yeah.
But if you weren't so open with us, with the way that it's a cultural norm to kind of keep our mouth shut and to so say that's none of my business kind of attitude, that's a general American, that's not my business. I'm not going to say anything, even though this is what I think kind of attitude.
Hmm.
But often those of us that do have our abnormalities, if our support system, and this is assuming we all have them versus what I was talking about that my therapist said, if they have that attitude, so they're not willing to point out to us, we may not be aware, so we can't get help.
Yeah.
We may not even know that we need help because we
Hmm.
don't even know that our perception of the world around us is not the normal perception because all we know is what we receive, the information
Yes.
that goes in and out of our head.
Mhm. Yeah. It's very, is it right to say, yeah, we're very linear vision on how we see things. To break that linear, you've got to have somebody on the peripherals looking in. And it doesn't matter if we have a disability or not. That's how we should interact with everybody. We should all be doing that. Now, like you said, in America, this might be something that's very thin to be quiet. Yet, coming from England, we're very good sometimes at putting our foot in it and saying something wrong, but it is never done with malice. And I'll give you an example here of sometimes putting your foot in it. I worked in an office, an administration office, many years ago, and somebody turns in, and jokingly, I look up and they said, "Oh, just been to the doctor." So, the thing of being to a doctor, you assume she's gone for a test of some kind. So you look
Right.
up and say, "So, positive or negative?" And I get such an awful, dirty look, like, "How did you know?" Well, it so happens about a day or two later, she announces that she's with baby. And everyone says, "Trevor, how did you know?" I said, "Well, I just put the pieces together.
Yeah.
But, I didn't assume that's where she'd been because she hadn't told her own family yet. And she didn't want to tell her work colleagues before she told home. But there was obviously something a little bit different about the way she was reacting. I didn't think it was that. I just thought maybe she'd just been, and, you put your foot in it. But the thing is, she did say afterwards, it actually made it easier to tell people at work because I made a stupid comment at that point, but it wasn't done with malice, and she realized that. So having that
But
sort
it
of
sounds like you
attitude.
also were not too direct, like what we would call blunt,
Mhm.
which is a
Yeah.
very common habit, unintentionally and many times unknowingly, of those with autism.
Mhm. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, you got to pick your words carefully,
Hmm.
and if you're trying to portray some humor into the environment, you cannot be pointing fingers directly at the subject matter.
Right, the topic. You have to kind of, as we say in America, um, go around the bush.
Okay, skirting around the edges, same thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think we're saying the same thing, but yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
But yeah, you can't be just too direct with them
Mhm.
because often you may convey the same message, but just by being blunt or too direct, it's offensive. While if you were to, ride the fence, like you said, um, then suddenly it's okay and it's nice and okay to ask without being offensive. But you
Mhm.
still got the same message across.
And if you do it with a little bit of care in the same way, it also warms the person to think, oh, okay. So if I need to have a little bit of support, that I see they realise and respect. So it is two things, isn't it? You can have people that respect the situation and are not very warming to approach and discuss the matter with.
Well, I think when it comes to communication for anybody with any kind of communication barrier or trouble that has to do with various conditions that our listeners may have, that the ultimate thing is knowing how to deliver. We may convey the same message, but we need to know what is the socially accepted form or method of delivery between tones, word of choice, and being a little bit more indirect while asking. And like you said, taking the tip of show your curiosity out of reasons that relate to care for the person that you're trying to get information out of, such as like a listener that may have a communication trouble, I would say take from this. Um, step one, show your care for the person that conveys the reason you want to know. And then carefully pick your words to indirectly, in a caring way, ask the question of to get whatever information, while making sure they do not put any accusations or any other potentially offensive content or words of any choice in the message, so that they don't offend the person to make the person believe that they're just being nosy.
Yes.
And that more so is important to take those techniques when we're talking about people we actually care about and we want them to know we care, and we're not just like, so to say, rubbernecking when we're driving, and it's like we don't even know that person is getting a ticket, but we want to know what's happening.
Yeah. And to I'll flip on the other side of the fence for that, to ask these type of questions, because I love splitting hairs and splitting both sides. I'll look up and come in and say, look, I'm not going to offend you intentionally, but I just don't know the right vocabulary to maybe ask the question. So I'm just going to be open here. So can you tell me, what is it that you have and how I can help? Is there a way that I can help? Because this is a new environment for me, and I know this is your life, but with a little bit of education on your part to me, you may find that I can actually help and assist, and maybe point you in the direction where you need to be, or I can actually be the aid that you need to bridge some gaps or issues that you're facing. And I think that's what a lot of people with uncertainty about certain ailments and disabilities, they just don't know where to start, and they don't want to be, oh, so you're blind. So does that mean you can't see anything at all?
Well, it depends upon what colorblind is. Colorblind, they can see objects, but it may be in different shades than the everyday people see, or it could be in black and white, but they're quote blind in another form, versus the totally see in black.
Yeah. And until you realize there are different stages and elements, person thinks blind as in full vision, no vision. So,
well, it's true, didn't think about poor vision, but when we say legally blind, people can see things, but it's so extremely blurry that often either there are no glasses of any strength that can help because of how severe the blurriness is, or that they have to have the thickest and strongest of glasses and strengths of them to see. They could both be labeled as legally blind, but like you're saying, it's not a black and white picture as far as they see or don't see.
Yep.
And that's like another, as you say, level or degree of blindness.
Yeah. So, I find that unless you've been immersed into a society with someone with some form of disability, especially let's go into a workplace, a lot of people there just never encounter people with disabilities or certain conditions. So they just don't know how to ask. And I think that's where the perception come across is like, well, anybody with a disability, they are not so well educated, or because they just cannot converse or express in the same way as the rest of us. Well, what's inside your head and what comes out of your mouth is no different than everybody else if it's a physical disability. But the perception that those, let's call them the 100% perfect people just have no way of addressing, because they've never encountered that environment or that situation or that person.
But I think you brought up something clever. They don't, these as in the everyday people that are, quote, normal in the work environment, don't want to understand them. And I think that's a big problem right there. They don't care to extend themselves to try to understand this special needs person. It's not just it's not they can't, it's not they shouldn't, it's they don't want to, because maybe it's too much work for them to be flexible or some other way accommodating to the special needs person, when that special needs person could be a very important person in getting their job done, because maybe it's their coworker, maybe it's their boss, or somebody else of that evolves around the person that doesn't care, the special needs could be somewhere evolved around that person's work environment or in their family or wherever else. It's like they're going to have to interact at some point if they don't
Yes.
already. So
Yeah.
it's kind of like you might as well get used to it.
Mhm.
But
And
the
I
missing
think also,
them not wanting to, not the person without the special needs being unable.
yeah. And also, to be fair, and I'm going to flip back on the other side for those, is when somebody approaches, you say, I've had this sort of question before, why don't people know? Frustration comes out of the person because it's like, why are you so curious? Why are you doing that? And that frustration can be perceived as a negative reaction. Sorry, I didn't know. But when you're the person receiving those sort of questions and that interrogation, you're a human. So of course your frustration levels go up, the anger level can go up, and maybe your response is not as calm and collected as the person who's asking the question out of naivety
And that's what I think
would
people need
expect.
to hear right now is that the person with the special needs could, so to say, react irrationally or unreasonably. And it is by far not their intention, or maybe not even something they're aware of based on what is their special needs. And because of that, the other people that don't have these special needs, the problem is they don't care to understand or they don't do research to try to understand, but they become quickly judgmental about, well, since that person's irritable a lot, like let's say if maybe they had bipolar, right? So they're irritable
Yeah.
a lot. It's become mania with bipolar,
Mhm.
that they shouldn't have a customer service job. Well, what if they were the one flipping the burgers and you're the one dealing with the customer? Well, maybe their mood doesn't do well with interacting with the public, but that doesn't mean they don't know how to cook a burger.
Exactly.
We're getting
Yeah.
into more of the educated kind of lines of work that I would desire for our listeners to pursue. Would be okay. So they're irritable, they don't get along with people, but they could be an accountant because they can still type in data. They can still, as long as they have the right education to develop the proper skills, analyze the financial numbers to say, or is this company profiting? Can we afford this other expense? Is this other idea of a new product or service an idea based on what I as an accountant see that's profitable or not? They could do that kind of job. It's something that doesn't require um, much social skills. I mean, you have to be able to deal with your boss, but you don't have to deal with the public
Yeah.
in like accounting per se. So often I think people need to realize this person with special needs, even if it is irritability or moodiness, as you may say, based on what is the special needs, they still can work a job. It's just it may be more restricting to what kind of job. And based on the job they work, they could be just as important as you, meaning the normal person that doesn't have special needs, or even more important if they're somebody like a CEO.
Yeah.
I mean, so often the public doesn't see that. They don't see that that person is of value
Yeah.
because of whatever is that special needs.
Everybody has their own unique skill set, and some skills are much stronger than others. Now, it's the skills that should adhere to the job and task that you're given to do, as opposed to the person you are.
Or that you choose to do, such as if any of our listeners are high school students and they're trying to use this to decide what to study in college.
Yeah.
So that should also be applied to their career of choice, and the career of choice being how they go from high school into what kind of studies of college to eventually pursue that type of job.
Yeah.
Like if
Because
somebody might right now be in college, okay, consider your limitations, consider your struggles. And while looking at what those may not block you from doing, see what aligns with those struggles not get in the way, but all of your skills and interests and hobbies and whatnot being of use, and put it together to find what is the right kind of major in college.
yes, use the skills that you've acquired, the ones that you enjoy using, and use the college platform to enhance those skills.
And
Because
or build
you
more
know,
skills, right?
yeah, because your working career is a long period of time. So you've got to go down the route of finding the things that make you comfortable. Something to learn, yeah, for sure, because we all don't want to just do things that we just don't have to think about. But learn new skills and do tasks, but find it in the area that brings you the enjoyment. So if you're
Passion.
very passionate in a sporting element, find sport as the main theme, but it doesn't mean you have to be the sports player.
But I
You
think
could.
they also need to look at personality related too.
Mhm,
Like a prime example. So my dad knew when I was in high school, I loved dealing with money and I loved math. So he was pretty darn confident, even though it ended up being wrong, that I would be a great accountant because I was even great at computers. And in the 90s, when it was a new thing to have computers, I could still quickly show my dad, here's how you do this to apply to a job. Or the other few things we did on the internet back in the 90s when it first was a new thing, you know?
mhm,
And
yeah.
so he saw that I was good at computers. I liked math. I liked money. So he thought that was my field. So he pushed me, between high school that I needed to find a college where I wanted to go to study accounting. He didn't say to pick what you want to study. He said to study accounting. I got into my undergraduate studies and I started researching what are different lines of accounting jobs, like specialties and so forth. And I thought I wanted to be a CPA. So I ended up from there pursuing my master's degree in accounting. Lo and behold, after I graduated my master's degree, I have a difficult time finding a job because I'm overqualified for some jobs because I have a master's with no experience. I'm underqualified for others because of the same thing that those that required a master's degree wouldn't hire me because I didn't have any experience. Those who required bachelor's wouldn't hire me because I was overqualified with a master's. I just found it in catch 22.
Mhm, yeah.
But part of that was to blame on the Great Recession that was going on back in 2008 when I graduated my bachelor's. And later was still happening in 2011 when I finished my master's. And so I ventured off after I landed a couple of, they're more clientele kind of jobs. They weren't actual employment, but like one of them was paying me $350 a month to keep his books. And another was paying me something like 18 an hour, but I needed something like 10 hours a month or whatever. So I had these certain clients and they were like independent contractor jobs, but I was quote employed, but not by technical terms, if you know what I mean, in the legality.
Mhm, yeah.
Um, so they could tell me when to come to work. They told me what I was to do. They had a set pay rate, and each of them had its own requirements and had its own office they gave me and everything. And I was like, I don't even feel like I fit in this world. Something's not right about this. And what
Mhm,
I found that was the key was my personality. You could probably pick up from our short conversation, Mr. Trevor, that I'm an extrovert. I was not happy sitting behind a computer, punching in numbers in text, like, the words, names of the accounts, all the other kind of text part. I was not happy doing that while staying quiet to myself in place of talking, engaging with other people, being social, and making money through the interaction with the public. And that's where I ended up realizing, yes, I'm great. I like dealing with money. Yes, I like dealing with the computer. I like these things, but I'm in the wrong place. And what was the key thing my dad didn't look at? And neither did I. I have to admit, it's both of our fault. My personality.
mm,
So
yeah.
that was the mistake we made together.
Mhm.
So I want listeners to hear not all this the other stuff you're saying that we need to look at, like our skills, our interests, our passions, but also our personalities. You don't want to end up like me where you study to be in a totally different field. This where you actually find your role in life.
No,
But that
that's
added
true.
how I opened my tutoring company because I later realized, hey, this tutoring I've been doing for free for 11 years, as of 2011. Somebody who is a vocational counselor told me, "Did you know you can get paid to do that?" And I'm like, "Why didn't you tell me that 11 years ago? I wouldn't have even ended up here."
Yeah, yeah.
And so that's where I developed my tutoring actual career and not hobby that I was enjoying. That was where my passion was.
Yeah.
And realizing, so yes, I tutor accounting since I have my 2 degrees in accounting, but still that it goes back to not only looking at your passions, but your personality.
Yes. Yeah, I see that. And providing that you've managed to, like you say, you've taken your accounting qualification and adapt those skills into something else. it's similar skills. You know, when you think about accounting and tutoring, they're kind of rules. You know, the rules that you need to learn to make this successful, to make the books balanced. So you're taking some of those elements and still running with it, because that's what develops your personality as your skills. There's a
Well, I
big
don't think it
input
develops
to
a
that.
personality, but I think it should evolve around the personality you already have, like extrovert versus introvert. There's nothing I could have done to make myself an introvert. So it didn't make my personality, but my personality.
Society could.
Huh?
Society could.
Well, that wouldn't necessarily be what I define as being society versus being our experiences in life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Such as someone who may be an extrovert but is bullied a lot may become more shut down and more introvert behaving.
Yes.
That doesn't mean that's their personality. So they may have those habits, but still not a part of who they are by character.
Yeah. But
And
that
often
can
those
have
that
a big
do
impact on
that,
people. Society can have a big impact on people to make that, like say, they can force extroverts into an introverted system, and until they break out of that cycle to become their natural environment, then that's so you can actually learn those
right,
skills along
this
the
is the
way.
missing key. It
Yeah.
may force that extrovert to be shut down,
Mhm.
but there's been research proving that when you try to change a person in a way like that, the extrovert that's not around people often or doesn't interact with people often, even if they're in the same room but stay quiet, shows symptoms of depression and other mood symptoms of being off balance. While it's not that they necessarily have that whatever abnormality in a condition, a disability, a special needs, whatever, but it's in other words that they've been, so to say, think in terms of a program, they've been programmed to behave that certain way, while as by definition of an extrovert, they gain their happiness through the interaction with other people. So by not interacting with other people, even if they're surrounded by others, they're pushing themselves deeper in the hole of depression and could even end up in suicide. So that's why I say here, I don't want the listeners to think you can change your personality to fit a certain job. Because I don't want someone that's that example of being an extrovert that is programmed to be quiet to end up in a unsocial to related career to then end up in depression as a result of not interacting with people. You see, I mean, it can cause things that can go wrong with their health, which can script their life in the whole. And so we don't want listeners to go in that direction. We want them to do what fits their already, what is just naturally who they are, personality, as part of their decision making in their career of choice.
Yes, in general, and I'm going to go to the extreme because I just want to do that. Because you know, if you think about those when we had the part of the conversation about people recognizing people's disabilities and not knowing that frustration, that in itself, if you're on the extreme and you're rather aggressive in the way you answer back, that as a learning process is an equal street where I need to accept that frustration. But also, if I'm giving out frustration, there might be a better way for me to learn a skill to deal with that frustration.
But that's not your personality. That's part of a condition in that example you're given.
Yes.
So yes, you need to be able to work with your providers of various sorts, your psychiatrist, whatever kind of doctor, your therapist, whatever, to have appropriate behavior. But the appropriate behavior is not your personality. In the example you're using, it's part of the condition that, yes, the condition needs to be controlled, maintained, and maybe even trained a certain way.
I like trained. I don't like the word
That's
control.
not their personality. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, but I think the personality comes across.
They lash out because they have PTSD, but that lashing out is not their personality. It's one of the hiccups or struggles within whatever condition, which yes needs to be trained and refocused and maybe get their feelings out on paper or whatever so that they're not hurting other people.
Yeah.
But you're making it sound like that's part of who they are, where I'm talking about personality and not behavior. Do you follow my?
I do. Oh yeah, I do. I just think some people don't see the distinction because they say this person's always aggressive, so that's their personality.
Okay, that's true from those that can be from both sides of the fence, though.
Mhm.
That can be someone like me who later in life realized he had a condition. So the whole time of not knowing about it, they thought it was who they were when it wasn't because they didn't know. But that can also be, like an example of me, someone on your side of the fence that's seeing me act out and thinking, well, she's just an aggressive or insulting or whatever else kind of person that they want to label them, right?
Yeah.
So that can be true on both sides. That can go back to the whole idea of what you and I were talking about, the awareness. There needs to be more awareness
Yes.
of these people
More
with these
awareness.
special needs, these struggles, and their importance in society, like as your company's about, of them being employed. But part of that process is employers as well as the people with special needs themselves, both recognizing the special need while finding a way to work around it so that the company, whatever employer, can appropriately accommodate while the person with the special needs knows they need to work with their providers to keep the certain behaviors appropriate for the workforce or whatever specific job within its certain expectations. Like your example, and not to lash out, not to be aggressive.
Mhm.
So it takes both of them need to be responsible for parts of this. Do you see that?
Yes, I do. No, I do. You know, I'm one that tries to look at both extreme sides, but hopefully that the conversation leads us down the right path. Because
Right.
yeah, if the main path is always here, but if you're not aware of what's to the far right and the far left of you, how can you really know that you're in the middle of the right path? Now our
Right.
path as we
Or which
go
side of the
will,
fence you're on if you're a part of it. Right.
yeah, and providing that you can realize a tendency to the right or to the left, to the good or to the bad, you know, the easy or the hard, whichever way you want to label either side of that fence. You know, we all travel that path, and we have to find the one that is easiest for us with the skills that we've learned to manage and deal with our life and our circumstances. And that's whether you have a disability or not. That is part of life, the way we grow, the way we pursue life.
Right. And that's why I think all of society needs to work together between the people realizing that they or someone they love has a condition, the people with the condition recognizing they have it and doing various research or other ways of becoming aware of what are their abnormalities, their limitations, uh, and how to work around them as well as with them. I mean, the conditions, the limitations. And that as a society, putting both ourselves with the conditions and our neighbors, friends, the public that are the people with them, if we're the employer, to work while doing it in a way that both sides, meaning employer and employee / contractor, benefit to the best of both interests, like the company profiting because of the important of the person with the condition doing it appropriately and well enough without causing, like your example of interaction and trouble within the workplace. So both sides are responsible. I think both sides need to hear
Yeah.
this podcast.
Yes, for sure. You know, and that's where awareness comes. You know, it has to get out to more groups, more diversities, because that's the only way that awareness grows. If it's not suitable for you today, it doesn't mean that tomorrow you're going to find somebody with a diversity or a disability or a different mindset.
Right.
Well, this has been a pleasure.
This has been a great conversation. Right, Kurt?
Yes, it has. So I'm gonna head on off to H&P Australia. It's been a great hour. So Emily, if you want to wrap this up, you are correct. It's been a good, compassionate citizens podcast. Back to you, Emily.
Amen.
So yeah, thank you guys for coming and for everybody who has tuned in. So
You're very welcome. And until the next one, it's a pleasure meeting you, Jennifer.
And same to you, Mr. Trevor.
I appreciate it. And hopefully we'll connect again and our paths will cross very soon.
Sounds great. Sounds like if all 3 or 4 of us cross paths again, it'd be great.
I'm sure. Well, I wish you a great remainder of your week, and see you all again soon.
And I wish you and your business well too. Take care.
Thank you very much. Take care now. Bye-bye.